So, Dr. Smith, one of the through lines I've seen in your research, whether it's about the impacts of pretrial detention, the burdens of being placed on electronic monitoring, or the issues with releasing someone from jail late at night, is the way in which policymaking is often disconnected from the human experience. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you got interested in that set of issues and how you see that disconnect impacting people who go through the criminal legal system and our communities as well.
Well, thank you for the question, Matt. So, how did I become interested in this issue? Broadly speaking, I began working in the area of punishment and inequality about 10 years ago. Before that, I was invited to participate as one of around 20 or so kind of experts. On what the Harvard Kennedy School has called an executive session. The executive session was on community corrections. I thought it was odd that I was invited to this because I had no prior knowledge of community corrections, but I had the research that I'd done in the past had been focused on vulnerable communities and specifically low-income Black people who were struggling to find employment. And my work at that time focused on the role that social networks and social capital played in connecting people to jobs and the kinds of barriers that existed to activating those networks in order to be able to find work and stay employed. So I was invited to be a part of this process, not quite sure why, because I didn't feel like I had the knowledge set to engage in any reasonable way, but it was an extraordinary opportunity connected with policymakers, practitioners, researchers, other academics like myself, to try to grapple with what it was that community corrections was doing, why their outcomes weren't better, what we could do, what kind of out of the box thinking we could do to improve its outcomes, perhaps reduce the footprint, allow for people to re-enter into society in ways that would increase the likelihood of their success. So I became a part of this conversation. And I say all this as a part of a lead up to the fact that one of the things that would happen in this space, we would convene 3 times a year, 2 to 3 times a year for like basically a long weekend, and have these really kind of intense conversations based on new research that was emerging, what we were learning about, new policies, et cetera. One of the papers that had been presented in this space was a paper that was written by a couple of scholars led by someone called Lowenkamp. And they had done an analysis based on administrative data from Kentucky that showed that spending any more than 1 day essentially in pretrial detention dramatically worsened people's short and long-term outcomes, right? So if you spent any more than a day, if I remember correctly, it increased the likelihood that you would have future criminal legal system contact and wouldn't show up for your bail hearings by like 40%. And every day over the next couple of days, it kept increasing. So again, I'm new to the space and I'm like blown away. Like, what is happening over the course of even a day that would fundamentally transform people's outcomes in ways that almost guaranteed that they would have future criminal legal system contact? That was outrageous to me. What is happening in pretrial detention that would make that the case? And then the other question was, if this is happening with regards to future criminal legal system contact, in what ways is it derailing people's lives in other ways? So I'm assuming if it's making it so that they're going back into the system, it's also impacting other areas of their lives. Employment, it has to be impacting their relationships, their connections to other institutions. And so it essentially that was like a moment for me where it was like, this is something I need to better understand. And at that time, there was very little research that had been done on this. I pitched a project to the Arnold Foundation. It was willing to fund a qualitative study that looked at people's experiences in pretrial detention and experiences with diversion to better understand the process by which that experience, even just 1 day, could dramatically alter their outcomes. And the book that I'm writing now is essentially kind of revealing what it is that I've learned through that process. So it was that moment, understanding that that intervention, pretrial detention, just even one day, could fundamentally alter people's lives, that struck me as a reason in and of itself to shift my focus of research from social capital and social networks, what that meant for especially low-income Black people, to looking at the ways in which the system essentially produces these horrific outcomes, in my mind, horrific outcomes. It's pitched as an intervention that makes us safe, and very clearly what was happening was something different, and I really needed to understand why. So it was the drive to understand why that led me into this area of research. And to be honest, I haven't looked back. It's just been, it's for in one way, it's just been an education for me. In another way, it's just a huge space around which a lot of work needs to be done. And so you just kind of feel a purpose, a mission to doing the work that we're doing. So that's how I got interested and why I'm in this space. There was a second part to your question that that I don't remember, but I'd love for you to repeat.
Yes. So it was really, how do you see this disconnect between policy making on the one hand and people's human experience and the impact on their lives? That disconnect, how does that play out in people's lives, and what impact does it have on communities?
So I think in one of the ways that we could highlight that is by talking about what happens, even with brief pretrial detention. That is, it increases the likelihood that you will lose your job or will affect your employment prospects. It increases the likelihood that you will be found guilty, and it increases the harshness of the punishment that you receive. It increases the likelihood that you will be burdened with fines and fees, so debt related to fines and fees, and that will also impact your loved ones who are often try to support you through that process. It impacts your ability to engage civically. People who experience pretrial detention in some ways withdraw from the political process. There's an aspect of that experience that means that people feel less like citizens and engage less like citizens as a result. It impacts your ability to find housing, to gain access to healthcare. It erodes your connection to each of these major institutions in ways that produce across a whole host of these domains much worse outcomes. And so it has devastating social, political, and psychological impacts on people. We all have heard about the kinds of horrific experiences that people have, even with short stays. And that also creates a kind of trauma that people take with them when they leave, and often aren't assisted with getting the access to the kinds of resources so that they can heal. So there are just a whole host of negative outcomes, again, that comes with even very short stays in pretrial detention. And so that gives you an example of this is a policy, pretrial detention, detain people, presumably because you want them to show up to their court hearings, although there's a lot of evidence to suggest just even providing people with reminders of their court hearings or the assistance with getting to court will address that particular issue. It means that people are being held in ways that dramatically produce much worse outcomes, and we're not paying attention to the ways in which something as short as a day or two could fundamentally transform people's lives for the worse.
One of the other areas that, in which your research, I think, has been very interesting is electronic monitoring, along those lines, sort of bringing to light some of the impacts that policymakers may not be thinking about on the people who are subject to electronic monitoring. So could you say a little bit more about what you found in that area?
Sure. It's so with regards to pretrial detention, pretrial electronic monitoring. First, I think I'd like to start out by suggesting what it is that we know from the few rigorous studies that have been done, and that is that there's a lack of clarity. There's no strong evidence that monitoring folks, putting that the monitor on people's ankles or however it occurs these days, actually makes it so that they are less likely to have future criminal contact or comply with the obligations that they have with regards to being released. They're no more likely or less likely to get involved in future criminal legal system contact and in the kinds of behaviors that would lead to further contact. So that alone suggests to me that, and that there's actually some evidence that suggests that it increases the likelihood that people will get into trouble because they fall out of compliance. And that's related to the whole host of issues that, or obligations that people are expected to meet when they are asked to put on that monitor. In most instances, people are asked to sign a document that says that they will comply with upwards of a dozen to 20 different kinds of obligations, many of which are at cross purposes and make it really difficult for people to achieve. Any one of them could find you out of compliance. They include things like staying out of trouble, never participating in any kind of behavior that will have you get into trouble with the law, which on some level, maybe people feel like that makes sense. But the truth of the matter is the vast majority of us on a daily basis engage in activities that, whether we know it or not, are often unlawful. But there are other things like staying away from particular loved ones, staying out of particular neighborhoods, finding a job. There's requirements that you have to call in to your supervisor whenever it is that your monitor goes off. Oftentimes, though, that happens at very kind of inopportune moments. You might be at work, you might be driving somewhere, you might be in a place where it'd be very difficult to do that. If you fail to do that, that could cause you to be outside of compliance. You have to make sure that your battery is constantly charged, but it's very difficult to keep the battery charged because they often have low charges. You might not have access to outlets that will enable you to do so. So this is just like one small set of the kinds of obligations that people have to meet, many of them very difficult to meet for folks with resources. If you're talking about people who are struggling with homelessness or housing instability, who are engaged in the kinds of activities, including employment activities, that make it difficult for them to be in places like this, it means that you're constantly at risk of being called in for being out of noncompliance. And so many of the people that we spoke with talked about feeling like they were being placed between a rock and a hard place. There was no way to comply with one without being out of compliance with another. How am I to get a job and keep this job if you keep requiring me to call when I'm at work, which disrupts my work? My boss is getting upset, and now I'm my employment is threatened. We had people who lost jobs because they were being monitored pre-trial. We had people who could not look for work because the restrictions around where and how they could move meant that they could not attend interviews. They could not seek the jobs where they were. They were outside of the range of possibilities. This was also the case with regards to trying to find housing. And so in each of these ways that we take for granted in terms of being able to move, the obligations that people had to meet with regards to their pretrial monitoring meant that they were constantly at risk of being out of compliance. And many went out of compliance for these very reasons, not because they had actually done something against the law, but because they had difficulties in navigating through the kind of labyrinth of conditions that they were made to follow, which would be, again, difficult under any circumstances, extraordinarily difficult if you lack the resources and the ability, the kind of flexibility to be able to address all of the issues that the system required. And so people suffered under that. And it got to the place where a number of people said, it would have just been better for me to spend my time in pretrial detention than to have have to deal with all of the hassles, which were constantly stressful, associated with being a part of these kind of pretrial monitoring programs. It wasn't a benefit in that way to be out. It seemed like it would be, but it wasn't. And so my preference was to just go through pretrial detention, get through that part of it, and then when I'm released for good, and I don't have to deal with this issue. And so it's in those ways that a system that presumably is set up to allow people to live their lives freely while their cases are being adjudicated. The actual obligations that are set up, the conditions of release are such that they make it very difficult, if not impossible, for people to actually engage in their lives in a meaningful way without the constant stresses and the constant risks of being brought back into the system in punitive ways. And so I think it was just another example, another setting where we see an intervention that presumably is supposed to be beneficial to all involved actually ends up doing a great deal of harm, to the point where people, again, are starting to think, well, maybe it was just better to go to jail. Maybe it's just better to be incarcerated for some short period of time and be done with this. So I think that's really, it's one of the many spaces. It's hard for me to identify a space where this isn't the case. The intervention actually ends up doing much more harm than good. And I just need to say this again, with the exception of domestic violence, I'm not sure that there is any space where research has shown that pretrial monitoring actually reduces the likelihood of future criminal contact and improves outcomes overall. It doesn't do it except in the very rare kind of cases like domestic violence, where that kind of being able to monitor people in that way allows you to kind of keep abreast of who might be at risk of doing harm to another person. Outside of that, the research is actually quite weak. And so it makes you wonder, why are we surveilling people at these levels? For the vast majority of people, you can let them out, let them know where their court dates are, remind them of those court dates, give them the kind of support that they need so that they can get back in and deal with their issues, and we'll be fine. But that's not what happens.
Thank you. And in discussing your research, you've mentioned a couple times talking to people, trying to understand their experiences. You've mentioned the term qualitative research. And can you talk a little bit about your philosophy to, or like approach to, criminal justice research, and how that might differ from or complement other sorts of research in the field?
So with regards to the first part of your question, I've thought a bit about this, and I think a particular distinction would be important to make at this point. So many of us have critiques of the criminal legal system. Not everyone, but many of us do. It's the problem for a whole host of reasons. There's a legal scholar, a law scholar, Benjamin Levin, who has kind of argued that there are essentially two kind of prevailing, fundamentally distinct critiques of the criminal legal system. There are the folks who essentially believe that the criminal legal system serves an important and legitimate function, but it's kind of gotten out of hand over the last 50 years. It's broken, and as a result, it criminalizes way too many people. It is too punitive, and we need to dial this back. And the way we would do that is by pushing for a set of remedies that will allow us to fix aspects of the system that are broken. And this will enable the system to function much more properly, the way we imagine it's supposed to be functioning. That's one critique. There's a second critique, which is the one that honestly makes the most sense to me. And it's based on my own read of the bodies of research, and also my own research, teaching, engagement with policymakers and practitioners. And it states essentially that the system is not broken. It's in fact operating the way it was intended to operate. It is intended in part to marginalize populations defined by class, those who are lower income, by race, those of color, especially Black, Latino, and Indigenous folks. And it also marginalizes people who are different in other ways, perhaps by sexual orientation, immigration status, etc. And it's used to exacerbate power imbalances. It allows those who are in power to maintain their power and enables the inequities that exist in the system to continue, which allows for the continuation of domination by race and class and other categories of difference. From this perspective, the remedy is not kind of reformist reforms or the kinds of reforms that nibble around the edges but don't fundamentally alter the power imbalances and inequities that enable oppressive structures and systems to continue to do harm. Instead, the remedy is to dismantle, from this perspective, these oppressive systems and construct new systems, ones that provide infrastructures of care so people get their basic needs met and they can live in communities where they don't just survive, but they thrive. And it also enables the development of institutions that actually lead to accountability, that actually lead to people who are harmed to get the repair that they need to heal and to be made whole. And so from that perspective, our approach would be very different. So with this understanding of the criminal legal system in mind, through my research, my teaching, and my engagement with policymakers and practitioners, and especially in my role as the faculty chair of the program in criminal justice at the Harvard Kennedy School, my intention is to help to identify the extensive harms that the criminal legal system does, especially for communities that are made vulnerable by race, ethnicity, class, and immigration status. My intention is to help to identify and to promote the types of interventions and investments that are needed to contribute to creating and maintaining stable, secure, and thriving communities. And for me, that often means decentering the police and other law enforcement agencies. And it also absolutely requires centering the voices, perspectives, and experiences of people from impacted or targeted communities so that we can better understand their challenges, their needs, which should be fronted in any kind of conversation about policy design and implementation. My sense is that it does not currently happen. As you suggested earlier in our conversation, it's something that it'd be nice if we could do it. Maybe it would reveal something, some cute kind of insights, but it's not, we don't associate that with the kind of what we call rigorous research, evidence-based policy making. And we do that to the detriment of the people in these communities because there's an incredible amount of knowledge and insight embedded in those communities that could help us. And I will say this and then I'll pause so that you can ask the next question. For at least 50 years, people from vulnerable communities have been asking for the kinds of investments, the kinds of engagements, the kinds of supports that current research finds would actually make the difference, right? Now that the experts of today are saying these are the things that are needed, we take it seriously. But for decades, people have been saying that these are exactly the things that they have needed and have not been taken seriously at all, right? So I think that this really tells us we should be paying far more attention to what it is that we can learn from the very people we say that we want to help. Instead, we often kind of turn our noses because they don't have the kind of methodological expertise, access to data, levels of education. And I think that we do that to not only a disservice to the work that we do, but a disservice to the people that we say we want to help.
And you just mentioned the types of supports that would be effective, that we know are effective, and that those being integrated more into policy discussions now. Can you talk a little bit about what types of supports those are?
I certainly can. And the way that I want to do this, if this is okay with you, is to talk about some of the work that I've done through the Roundtable on Racial Disparities in Massachusetts criminal courts. We engaged in a study of 4 neighborhoods in the Boston area. And what we wanted to know from the residents of these 4 neighborhoods is what it was that they thought would allow their communities to thrive. So we're asking them, what does a thriving community look like, and what would your community need in order for you to feel as if it was a thriving community? And our goal in doing this was to understand how residents of these communities conceptualized healthy, safe, and thriving communities and what role they saw for law enforcement in this process. From these, we did 22 focus groups across these neighborhoods. And from these focus groups, what we learned is that there were kind of 2 elements that people felt like they needed to be able to create and maintain healthy, safe, and thriving communities. One was a sense of community cohesion and collective efficacy. They wanted a community where they felt like there were lots of activities that brought people out, had them engaging with each other. They got to know their neighbors really well, were engaged with them in a real way, connected with them around issues that were important to the residents of the community, broadly speaking, and that enabled them to both understand the problems that they face together and solve those problems together, right? So they saw these activities, what's going to bring us out? It could be the farmers market that happens a couple of times a week, or maybe it's a community garden or some such thing. We are participating in that together. As a result of that, we're developing these relationships, and those relationships help us to be able to solve our problems. So that was one thing that they mentioned, one key element. The other is that they felt like they really needed to feel free from harm and violence. And it was this expectation of fear of violence that made it so that a lot of folks just kind of stayed in their homes, stayed in their apartments, and weren't willing to come out. They linked these core elements. They emphasized how violence, which was endemic to some of the neighborhoods where we interviewed people, it eroded the community's social fabric and made it difficult for them to connect. They shared doubts. They put doubts of the shared expectations, and it made it so that it obliterated their collective efficacy. What did they see as important here? To achieve the levels of cohesion that they felt like they needed to thrive, the residents emphasized the need for communities to have significant investments in the built environment. Right? We need good roads, we need good housing, we need access to parks, etc. They felt like they needed investments in human capital. They felt like the schools in their communities were not good schools. Access to kind of post-secondary education was absent. And so folks who were adults didn't feel like they had opportunities to develop their skill set so that they could be marketable in the current economy. They wanted access to health institutions that would help with their health and well-being. This included access to hospitals, clinics, but it also included access to substance use and abuse centers. We have lots of people who are struggling with drug issues. They need support. We need to have those folks get that support. They needed access to resources for mental health supports. There are a number of people who talked about how levels of mental illness were relatively high, and the folks who needed support were not getting it. And so they wanted investments in their communities with regards to the built environment, with regards to human capital, with regards to residents' health and well-being, and felt like they were often ignored. Those needs were often ignored. For them to thrive meant having those basic needs met. For them, those were basic needs: safe and affordable housing, good quality education, a freedom from hunger, access to quality health care, broadly defined, opportunities for mobility, human capital access, initiatives and programs for youth engagement, and a robust physical infrastructure in green spaces. These were all the things that these residents talked about. You know what they centered least? Law enforcement. Greater presence of law enforcement in their communities. They thought through these investments, it would make it so that people had the things that they needed, so that crime and other evidence of disorder would go down significantly. And they're right. Research finds exactly what it is that they say that they need. Research has shown when those investments are made, we see significant reductions in crime that are on the order, if not larger, than we see when you do research on what happens when you increase the number of police officers in your neighborhood. So we could make those investments. If we were to make those investments, we would see substantial improvements. Importantly, though, I bring this up because the residents themselves understand this to be the case. Do they see a role for law enforcement? They certainly do, but they vary in terms of the role that they see law enforcement playing, with some folks feeling like police are protectors and can do some work, others feeling like they're flawed but potentially salvageable, but they really have to take our needs seriously, and others feeling that police are just violence workers. They do as much, if more harm than anyone else, and so we just don't want them in our spaces. But what I want to really stress here is how important those investments were in their minds in terms of thinking about how it is that they could, their communities, in their communities, they could be well placed to not just survive, but thrive. And I think that those are the places where our investments can go, and those are often where our investments are not made.
Speaking about that, it reminds me of something that I've seen in some of your work, including your work on pretrial detention, is sort of different definitions of public safety, right? One being just protection from physical harm, the other being having basic needs met. And I'm wondering if you've seen the idea of a more comprehensive understanding of public safety, one that includes those basic needs. Has that been gaining traction with policymakers? And if so, have you seen that play out?
Yeah, I do think that that has gained some traction in some communities. So here in Boston, it is very clear that the current mayor, Michelle Wu, has engaged in a set of investments along the very lines that I just mentioned. And I haven't seen rigorous research done on this, but it would not be unreasonable to imagine that as a result of some of these investments in these very areas that I just described, and housing, education, freedom from hunger, access to healthcare, et cetera, has been one of the contributing factors to the declining rates of crime, including violent crime, that Boston has been known for. I think Boston has experienced some of the large declines across the country in terms of its levels of crime. Mostly people have focused on the reforms to the police department. I think as important were the investments that were made in these communities. And so we do see in some places, in places that I think that are more progressive leaning, some of these investments are being made. And we are also seeing the fruits of those kinds of interventions. I think there is a question about whether we can expect it to expand outside of the more progressive spaces. And I think we should also take seriously the fact that a city that is fairly progressive one year, the next year could be a very different place. And we've seen this with regards to San Francisco. Very kind of progressive DA was replaced by someone much less so. And with that change came much more punitive approaches to crime and disorder. So there are concerns related to this. It's not a kind of norm to respond to crime and disorder in this way, despite the fact that sustained investments of these kinds would almost certainly produce sustained benefits in terms of lower rates of crime and far less disorder.
So that's a good example, one of many we've discussed of like the value of bringing community, bringing people with experience into the policy making discussion. Do you have suggestions for policymakers about how to engage in sort of those discussions, how to pull in the expertise of people with lived experience into discussions around policy?
I think that that's a great question. So I mentioned earlier that for about 3 years, I ran what I call the Roundtable on Racial Disparities in Massachusetts Criminal Courts. That brought in the heads of many of the kind of criminal legal system agencies, especially in and around Boston, but also across state. And here we really thought seriously about how to address the disparities we saw in various areas of the criminal legal system domain. We invited about 30 people to participate in that process. And among those were 5 people who had had contact with the criminal legal system. I think all combined, there might have been at least 80 years of time spent behind the wall. And that was an extraordinary experience for a number of reasons. What I will just start out by saying the kind of insights that they brought to our conversations were huge. And I'm not sure that we would have been able to kind of make the kind of inroads we did in the conversations that we had, and thinking through ways of resolving particular issues, addressing inequities without them being a part of the conversation. But what was very clear, at least in the initial stages of our 3-year kind of convening, was that it was really difficult for the people who ran criminal legal system agencies to act as equals with the people who had had that previous criminal legal system contact, right? Again, they are the experts. I run this agency. I've done this. I know about this system. What do you know? These were people who, in any other context, would be the criminals that they had treated, not equals in thinking through what the nature of the problem is and how to resolve it. And so I think it becomes really critical to place in conversation as equals in this process people who both have been a part of this system, running the system that I would argue is doing a lot of harm, but that is intended presumably to achieve justice, but also the people who have, been brought into the system and punished within the system. And I would actually argue, too, it would be important to bring in the people who are the family members or community members of the folks who are brought into it. So communities, whether you have been incarcerated or not, should be the ones who are targeted for the kinds of interventions that have led to high levels of incarceration and other forms of punishment, should be at the table and should have equal right to say and promote their ideas, and maybe in some ways even be given an extra vote in terms of decisions that are made. Without folks at the table who understand what that experience is because they've lived it, or because their loved one has lived it, and so they've experienced it as a relative in that process, I think we will continue to fail in the work that we do. And I should say this too: I've seen examples where people who have had experience, they have been system impacted, have been brought into the kind of circle of discussion, and then have been, how do I put this? There's a way in which at some point they come to see themselves much more as a part of the system itself and not as the person who's been impacted by the system. They come to take on, in some ways, the identity of the people who brought them in, as opposed to the people who they were once a part of, and their decisions come to look very much like that. You can actually hear it in the language. It becomes them as opposed to us. I think it's critical that the folks that we bring in understand that they're coming in as in a way as representatives of the folks who continue to be kind of punished or corrected by the system. To the extent that they lose that, I think you could actually lose an opportunity to make the kinds of inroads that are possible. So all this to say, Matt, that unless we not just engage through our research, I think it goes well beyond people like me who do qualitative research, learn from people about the nature of the experiences and share that. I think it actually requires people who have been system impact to be a part of the research process. They are helping to decide what the research looks like. They are part of the policy making and design process. They are part of the implementation process. They are fully integrated into it in ways that allow them to be equal in terms of power, and equal in terms of determining how these will play themselves out. I think we'll achieve much more just outcomes if we were to engage in that way. At this point, however, folks who are system impacted are not viewed as people who are the experts. Their expertise is kind of dismissed, in part because they don't have the levels of education that tends to be respected in this realm. But they're also dismissed because they have the criminal record, right? The mark of the criminal record in some ways is delegitimizing. And that is the very thing, in my opinion, that should legitimize them in this process. So I think that there are a number of issues that have to be addressed in order to make this possible in the ways that I'm imagining. But unless we have a situation where they have equal weight in terms of the decision making around how we think about these problems, what gets constituted as a problem, the kinds of solutions we come up with, and how those get implemented, I think we will continue to have a system that continues to do far more harm than good. You did ask a couple other questions that I thought a little bit about, and so I'm hoping that I could share my response to one other thing, which might be a little bit of an overlap, but I think it's important nonetheless. And one of the things that I think we should be concerned about, what are the factors that make it so that policy making is so cut off from people's actual experiences, and I think that that's really important. And some of my observations from my experience on the roundtable on racial disparities in Massachusetts criminal courts kind of shapes my thinking around this. One is that I do think that there's just a general lack of knowledge around people who are running many of these criminal legal system agencies about what it is that these systems do to people. There's a lack of knowledge around a number of things. There's a lack of knowledge around the set of challenges that people face that make them vulnerable to criminal legal system contact. So they don't understand what makes it so that this becomes a risk factor. There's also a lack of knowledge about the extent and nature of the harms that the criminal legal system, the systems that they run, do. They don't realize how harmful those systems are oftentimes. Not always, but often in some cases. And in terms of ideas for how to address it, okay, so here's the problem. How do we address these issues? They're also, in some ways, to be honest with you, clueless, right? And so it means, what do you do? You don't do anything. In the process of kind of organizing the roundtable, what became very clear was how little folks in these positions of great power knew about the poor outcomes that their systems were leading to. And so throughout the process, throughout the 3-year process, they kept saying, it'd be great if you offered like courses or seminars so that we could learn about X, Y, and Z. The judges would really appreciate this, or the DAs would really appreciate this, that we would really love to learn. So there's a lack of knowledge that needs to be bridged in order for folks to better understand. And I think it really should come from disciplines that I think are very knowledgeable about those sets of vulnerabilities. There's also the issue that knowledge about how to affect change comes primarily from experts. My sense is that they don't trust what they hear unless it comes from people who've been certified by places like Harvard, right? And who work with big data. So it both has to be the folks with the PhDs and the fancy degrees, and those who work with big data. People who get pulled into the system are not considered experts in their own lives, and that has to fundamentally change. They get discounted, and as a result, we don't understand deeply what the nature of their problems are. We have to take seriously that if we present people who run these agencies with the issues that their agencies help to create, they're often quite defensive, right? I've been working in this institution for 20, 30 years. My institution would never do this kind of work. They're often far more committed to protecting the reputation of the industry or of their institution than they are of addressing the set of issues in a very real and sustained way that their institution might be creating. And so here's an example. If what is required to produce better outcomes is to reduce the footprint of the criminal legal system. And that would mean, and that would lead to more just, equitable outcomes. My sense is that few would be open to such a move, right? That's a shift in how the institution is viewed, but it would also have a major impact on the community of professionals that they're part of. Reducing the footprint would essentially mean cutting a substantial percentage of the workforce, the very people that they feel very much connected to. So we have to think about how it is folks who work in these institutions, that the level of connection, what that means about their kind of commitment to the institution and protecting the institution, but also protecting the folks who are their co-workers. The kinds of changes that would be needed would actually threaten both the institution and the people who work in them, and we should take that seriously. And then the other thing is perhaps very obvious. These systems are extraordinarily complex, to say the least. Undoing them would be a massive undertaking that would take decades to accomplish. And I think for a lot of people, it would just be easier to just kind of, muddle along doing what it is that we're already doing, instead of trying to begin the task of undoing what has been extraordinarily harmful to many communities across the country. So I just wanted to share what kinds of things. That's just a short list. There are many other factors that get in the way, but my experience on the roundtable lead me to kind of really highlight those really important issues.